So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to welcome you to the German Marshall Fund's webinar with titled The Role of the Private Sector in Shaping Global Politics. And we'll spend about an hour together. My name is Melanie Whittaker. I'm with the German Marshall Fund. I'm based in the Berlin office. And today I have with me Dr. Fritzi Köhler-Geib, who's the chief economist for the KfW banking group, Simone Mori, who is the head of Europe for Enel, and Aishah Miller, who joins us from Philadelphia and is a senior vice president of Wells Fargo Bank. So what will happen with the next hour is that our three discussants will give us some impulses and share some of their thoughts about the role of the private sector in shaping global politics, after which we will very quickly open it up to questions from the audience. And I would like to give you a little bit of background of why we are having this seminar. So when we first talked about this topic amongst the group, it was really based on the 75th anniversary of the European Recovery Plan, better known as the Marshall Plan, that will occur this year on the 5th of June. And it also coincides with the German Marshall Fund's 50th anniversary. So, but then February 24th happened, and what became very apparent very quickly evermore was really the role of the private sector in global politics, and particularly when sanctions were called for, and how the private sector also came together and what the impact of their activities and their actions are in societies, but also into politics. And I would also like to quote our new president, or Heather Conley, our German Marshall Fund's president, who did a beautiful quote earlier today. And she said that the Marshall Plan was all about giving hope. And it is essential, paraphrase her, and it is essential that people have hope now that there will be a better future. And with that, actually, I would like to turn over to Fritzi, who will be giving us some impulse on what her thoughts are, what a future and a reason for a recovery plan could be. And as many of you probably know, the KfW banking group was the organization, or the KfW Bank was the organization that implemented the original Marshall Plan in back then West Germany. So Fritzi, I'll have you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melanie. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I think, as you pointed out, the thoughts about the Marshall Plan today are extremely relevant. When talking about this, I was reminded of a book that I recently read. I think you can see my slides, I guess, about the swerve from Middle Ages to Renaissance. And at that point, there were also ideas that had been around for a long time from antique times that all of a sudden gained traction due to a change of circumstance. And I think already in the COVID crisis, we had a change of circumstance, but also the Ukraine war is such a change of circumstance with all the terrors that we are seeing and that it's bringing over people. There is the possibility that it would bring the ideas that we've seen on digitization and climate neutrality, the transition, the dual transition, to different meaning, and could lead to it becoming a reality. At the swerve from medieval ages to Renaissance, we had the antique ideas. I'm trying to move on with my slides here to go to the next slide. Now it's not working, of course. Let me see if this now works better. The antique ideas all of a sudden inspired, due to that change of circumstance, artists and also scientists to push away the golden wall that the church had established in front of paradise and started to examine the world around, to represent it in art, and to really research it. This idea of the swerve in current times, I'd like to point out, in terms of three key messages. The first message is, as I mentioned, that there are those that we become more conscientious about risks and developments, and that those can actually give traction to ideas of digitization and the move to climate neutrality that at the same time have become more difficult to reach through COVID and also the Ukraine war. So first message, we're heading into this transformation under challenging circumstances. Second main point I'd like to make is that the transformation to a digital and green economy requires large investments. And the third main message is that key for success are an investment-friendly environment and smart financial instruments. So let me explain what I mean by this. Coming to this first point, that we enter now or continue in this transformation under challenging circumstances. In Germany, we've seen a reduction in corporate investment relative to economic activity. And we've seen this trend for a long time, which of course, when we think of a transformation, is bad news. And there is good reason to believe that the war in Ukraine is exacerbating this trend, because we see here at the end that we again see a drop in business confidence. We're also seeing that in our surveys, that a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises are worried about their perspectives of economic activity. And in these circumstances, companies are very reluctant with investment, which of course is a challenge, again, for the transformation to actually be put into a reality. With this, I'd like to come to the second point, that the transformation is costly with regards to digitization and also the transformation to climate neutrality. And again, I'd like to bring here a German perspective. We've seen that in the small and medium-sized business sector, we've seen investment on digitization in the year 2019 in the sector as a whole that was half as large as the investments that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google alone spend only on their cloud investments. So this comparison makes very clear that there is a lot to be caught up in these areas. So we may have some countries with very large sectors where you see a lot of advancement. With regards to Germany, there is area to catch up. When it comes to the transformation to climate neutrality, we came out with a study recently that showed that investments amount to 5 trillion euro to reach climate neutrality by mid of the century. This breaks down to around 190 billion per year, of which 72 billion are additional investments beyond investments that are anyways required. So yes or yes, these are large investments, and they won't be only realized neither by the private sector nor the public sector. They will have to come out of combination of both. When we think about factors of success, I'd like to mention here a investment-friendly environment. And for this, I think one of the main factors is a reliable framework for investment. You could think of a reliably increasing carbon price that would also deliver investment incentives in the direction that is needed to reach climate neutrality. But we also need acceptance by society from a social and also a regional perspective, which basically we see still is a huge topic of dispute, and where balance needs to be achieved, maybe even also through transfers. There is an argument about preserving international competitiveness, and here carbon border adjustment mechanisms are an instrument that could be helpful. Finally, also capital markets need to play their role to steer capital flows into this area of investment. When I think about those investment instruments, I think a very useful way of organizing thoughts is along the degree of maturity of technologies that need to be used. When we think of technologies at a very incipient stage, today those would be carbon capture and storage or carbon capture and utilization. There you need subsidies, tax benefits for research and development. When we then move into market introduction, there you actually need promotional loans. You also have the venture capital market for startups. And then also you need promotion of demonstration projects. One example is in 2011, we had wind offshore parks in the North Sea. They were not bankable at that point. They were supported by KfW. Today, they are highly profitable. And when you then move into diffusion of products, so this would be heat pumps, for example, in private households at this point, their investment loans are a very good instrument, or promotional loans. So you see it's really a mix of the private sector with its innovation, but also with incentives that the public sector can set, and also the frame that the public sector has to provide for those investments to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Fritzi. And I would next invite Simone to answer. And thank you, this was very insightful. And Simone, when you and I spoke a couple of days ago about this webinar we're holding now, and Fritzi, you just said that there is acceptance by society into these large investment structures. We know from history that the US under George Marshall went on a huge campaign throughout the US to actually get support, public support for the European Recovery Plan. And Simone, when you and I spoke, you put a beautiful framework, a slight historical framework about the Marshall Plan. So I'd really love for you to share what you told me, but also your thoughts about going forward. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Melanie. Indeed, I made some reference to my personal professional history. So when I started to work in the energy sector, I represent here Enel, which is a large utility, the largest utility in the Western world, multinational operating in 40 countries. And actually, when I was a young professional in the company, many of the power plants where we have to make some intervention, some repair, were built in Italy through the support of the Marshall Plan just after the Second World War, which was the electrification and availability of energy for citizens and companies was one of the key pillars, if you want, of the Marshall Fund. And it works quite a lot. You know, there is a kind of metaphor that may be mentioned here, because we have been discussing a lot in Europe. So we are based in Berlin. We are dealing with Brussels, the recovery and resiliency plan. And as you know, energy, also Fritzi was mentioning several examples coming from the energy sector. Energy is one of the pillars of investment of this plan. And there is a clear evidence that energy is at the center of the transformation. If you want Europe, we all deal with European values and European evolution as a continent, as unified economy. And if you want the very roots of European idea were into the European coal and steel community, which was created at the very beginning of our modern history after the Second World War. So, I mean, energy has a very important role in the discussion we are having. So business and policies and society. And that's not by chance that today, I mean, if you look just at the real-time discussion about also the Ukrainian crisis, the utilization of the energy dependency as a tool of pressure towards the economy. So it's something which is in the middle between, I would say, the conflict management and economic competition. Well, it's a very, very important role. I just wanted to make a couple of comments, then I will leave more time to the discussion. So I'm not following, a structured line, but I think it's useful now to highlight a few points, and then we may react to the question of our audience. First one, that there is a strong connection between our policies in order to manage international crises, such as the Ukrainian one, and the decarbonization net zero long-term vision of Europe and also in the US. I mean, there are plans which are quite similar in some way, or some coherence with what European countries are trying to do. Because energy transition means putting in place investments, huge investments, and technologies which are today ready. More of them are ready. Some of them are going to be ready in the next years, which will imply the possibility to reduce our impact on the environment, to avoid emissions that may undermine climate. But in the meantime, this is a model bringing to a much stronger and resilient economy for our continent, because just, Europe is heavily depending on the import of commodities. Now, the focus is on the import on Russian commodity, but we had in the past similar problems because of the dependency on commodities coming from fossil fuels, coming from other continents and other regions. So energy dependency means a fragile structure of our industry and economy. Net zero, decarbonization, energy transition, you may talk it as you prefer, is also absolutely coherent with the idea of growth. There was this kind of debate, especially at the beginning of the process of the energy transition, among different industrial sectors. And this process was presented as a process potentially putting in conflict the reasons of the environment and the planet safeguard and the reasons of the industrial and economic growth. There is not contrast. There is not clash between these two principles. Many studies are being carried out also by the European Commission, but there are many independent analysts demonstrating that decarbonization brings huge amount of investments, as Fritzi demonstrated, brings a huge technological effort, a huge engagement of the private sector, and the finance. We may mention the issue of financing. The change was mentioned in the previous intervention. We may mention the booming of the sustainable finance, for example, promoting the investments aimed at decarbonizing society. And all that will create jobs, will create growth, will create relative competitiveness of the societies and economies which will be pioneering the transformation. Of course, you were mentioning this, Melanie, at the beginning. This implies a societal change. This is not, going back in time again, when in the world that was created during the Marshall Plan period, the energy investments were very much top-down. So there was long-term planning, huge centralized investments, hierarchical structure of the energy sector, long time to market, very much concentrated power of control of these assets. Now we are shifting towards a model which is more and more decentralized, many more players, a very strong participation of the overall community. I mean, just to give you an example, the next stage for decarbonizing economy is decarbonizing transport. The decarbonization of transport starts not through, large investment of companies such as Enel, but starts from the choices that European and North American and Asian customers will make when buying a new electric car instead of a diesel car or of a gas-propelled car. So it's, this engages the society, engaging the community at a whole is very, very important. And also relying on the ability of our educational system to help our citizens to be ready for this challenge, which means in a way to be very strong in creating the right skills that are very hard to find, and that's a quite common issue in the Western world. I mean, we are struggling to have talents for sustaining the digital evolution of our networks, for example, or the digital implication of running a renewable intermittent plant into an energetical system, but also the reskilling, because there is a big change in the platform of job creation in our economy. So again, it's a very broad program, but as a company, we went through this transformation. We were basically, 90%, 80% based on fossil fuels few years ago. Now we are the number one top worldwide leader in the renewable development, and this may be done. It's an exciting phase, but it's so important. And again, not only because of for the sake of protecting the climate and the planet, but because this will create a stronger, more resilient, and richer society for everyone. So of course, we may elaborate more during the discussion. Thank you very much, Melanie.
Thank you, Simone. And this is actually a really beautiful segue into Aishah, who Aishah and I talk quite often actually about, and I'm very, very pleased that she's joining us today and gives us really, from her perspective, a very human-centric view on what a transformation must entail to be successful. And so, Aishah, I won't even say more. Let's let you speak.
Thanks, Melanie. I really appreciate it. I wanted to thank the German Marshall Fund for having this panel. I love that we do this stuff and have these conversations. I think we move things forward by talking about this. And I just want to take a quick moment and just send out an acknowledgement of the Ukrainian people and the experience that they're having at this moment. It's extraordinarily tough, and we just have to honor what they're going through and the profile and courage that President Zelensky is demonstrating on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that, as I go into my comments about how we transform in terms of how the private sector has an influence in politics. And I have notes here, so you're going to see me going. I may not look straight ahead because I'm looking at my notes, but I'm going to go through these notes, and I look forward to our conversation later. And I do go right after Simone, like where Simone went in terms of decentralization and the fact that we have more players. And I do want to harken back to the Marshall Plan, which is, it's like the greatest feat of diplomacy of our time, right? The Marshall Plan with $13 billion from the US. It was a huge effort for Western Europe in terms of building out international finance, trade, industry, agriculture. And I think everyone is starting to do this thing right now, calling for a Marshall Plan for multiple things. It's almost become nomenclature for transformation, right? We just saw Jamie Dimon released his shareholder letter yesterday, and in his letter he talked about a Marshall Plan for energy security. Simone, really speaking to what you're talking about and responding to the Ukraine crisis and the dependency on gas and oil from Russia and how that creates issues in terms of our pricing. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the Marshall Plan, but that's what Jamie Dimon talked about. But we do want to remember that the Marshall Plan, when it was developed, it had a private sector lens. And so we had private sector people deeply involved in it. I mean, Truman really relied on the CED, the Committee for Economic Development, in terms of how he built that plan, because there were commodities and interests that the corporate sector had that they wanted to protect. But there was a control approach, that's a singular approach. And I think that we're in a different time now. So when I talk about the Marshall Plan and I use it as my nomenclature, I say Marshall Plan 2.0. Anybody that knows me always knows that I talk about 2.0s, because I think we have to acknowledge the environment that we are in. We're in an environment that is pushing for inclusivity. We're in an environment that both Simone and Fritzi talked about, a hyper digital, hyper technologically advanced. In addition, our political environment is highly polarized, right? So the interest in a unilateral Marshall Plan from the US, with US citizens behind an investment at that level, it would be a challenge, just to say the least, right? And speaking to our energy environment, our cybersecurity environment, the question of data and data infrastructure, and the fact of the matter is that our populaces has changed. The reality is, if we had a Marshall Plan today, or Marshall Plan from 1948, I wouldn't be sitting at that table, nor would anybody that I know be sitting at that table. But now we have more people, we're more democratized, right? And so we now have to really think about this inclusive way from a corporate perspective of moving forward. So with that said, in terms of transformation, what I wanted to talk about today was stakeholder capitalism. You know, everyone's probably heard of it. People have called it a theory, they've called it a management style, but the real concept of it is the corporate sector, the private sector, shifting from this pure shareholder value perspective, shareholder primacy, to this ecosystem of stakeholders. And that stakeholder ecosystem is inclusive of, as Simone mentioned, communities, which are extraordinarily active and engaged right now, you know, suppliers, employees. The company Chobani is very involved in engaging employees in, you know, refugee support. I just think we need to think about this at the perspective of way private sector can get involved in a more complex way as well as a top-down approach. This is a long-term value play. Stakeholder capitalism is about long-term value. It is not about short-term profits, and it's about really turning business into the power that it can be in terms of supporting where we are in the current state. So we're not talking about crony capitalism. We're going away from unrestrained capitalism. This is an idea of inclusive capitalism. And the work that I do with Melanie is around business and society. That's the language we use for that in terms of aligning business and society impacts so that we can have a real transformational approach. What I'd like to say is I would like to say what stakeholder capitalism is not. So one of the things that happens when we get into stages, when we start talking about private sector being responsible or private sector being a stakeholder in the change that we need in this country and in other places, is that the private sector is not a charity. Private sector will always have the profit motive. That's just never going to change. We have to kind of accept that as a fact. The private sector is also not the government. It needs to be aligned with the government, as Fritzi said, but it's not the government, and it's not activism. So I just wanted to be very clear on those things. And we are talking about accountability. So when we talk about the ecosystem of stakeholders, we're talking about corporations being accountable to the multiplicity of stakeholders that are within their scope, including shareholders. This is not eliminating shareholders. This is lessening shareholder primacy and being inclusive of the multiple stakeholders to actually influence the development and change that private sectors can actually do. And our current environment demands it. I mean, we're talking the political polarization, the war, the pandemic, climate issues that Simone and Fritzi talked about. Nuclear proliferation is still an issue. Income inequality, rampant, and we need to work on that. I mean, we need Marshall plans for places like Haiti, Mexico, Syria. We just need a Marshall Plan for the planet, which Fritzi said. So, and some examples of corporations who are doing this, and I wanted to say this before I close, is we have Chobani, as I mentioned, with their work for tent for refugees that just shifted to Ukrainian refugees, but originally were with Afghan. Clorox is doing pay equity work, B corporations, JP Morgan Chase shareholder letter. There's just a lot of people doing this work. Deloitte just created a purpose office with Kwasi Mitchell as the chief purpose officer. And there's some accountability groups called Just Capital who are trying to provide some accountability metrics for corporations to be able to be involved. But I want to stop. So I just ran through my notes because I wanted to get all this stuff in front of you because I wanted to have a stakeholder capitalism conversation. I'm having some issues with my computer, so if I drop off, I'll come back on. But this is about hope. This is about hope, and this is about human freedom, right? We're talking about how do we encourage democracy, human freedom, and hope, and it's in the times that we're in now. And everything I'm saying is about really bringing the private sector away from the black and white, good or bad concept, and more to the table of how we all work together to move all these initiatives. And I'm happy to talk about that with anybody on the call, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Aishah. And I remember some part of what you said also about the stakeholder or shareholder. And I think one expression I like to use is go away from total shareholder return to total societal impact. Yes. So how do you have that holistic view on things where you bring in everybody and be aware that it is, or as we heard from someone else recently, profit is not a bad word, it's what you do with it. And maybe how you make your profit. And there are already a couple of questions, and I think the first question is for Fritzi, and it's since the CCP controls the raw materials needed for the green revolution, How do you avoid trading dependence on today's coercive fossil fuel sources for simply another potentially coercive agent who controls the materials for the green transformation? Okay, I think that really is a question for Fritzi or Simone. So who would like to answer that? It's also in the chat. If that was
happy to take a first stab at it, and then I hand on to you, Simone, but also very happy to do the other way around.
No, please go ahead. I compliment eventually.
Perfect. I think it's a super central issue, because I think there is no doubt that reaching independence from fossil energy sources doesn't mean we will be independent from raw materials. We will be dependent on other raw materials. And I think there is really a key issue how we think about those dependencies in a more strategic manner. I think we have some players that have been very strategic for a long while. And I think in Europe, countries have not been as strategic. And if in the context that we're experiencing right now, I think what is needed is altogether to move to a way of doing business, of economic activity that is less dependent on fossil energy and less dependent on other raw materials. So we need a resource efficiency. We've seen in Germany that resource efficiency has increased tremendously between 2000 and 2016 by 35%. However, in total, we are consuming more resources because the economy has grown in between. Also, there is still way to go when we think about efficiency. I think we need to think much more carefully and seriously about circular economy. I find one number really impressive. When you produce steel from steel scraps, you need 70% less energy than if you produce it from primary raw materials. And then, of course, we won't be able to become independent from raw materials, but one needs to think there in, I think, raw material partnerships. And I think we have to be more conscientious about the benefit on both sides of making a deal on raw materials and considering these also as long-term engagements. And I guess there will be areas where there are trade-offs between resource security and sustainability. And I think there will be hard choices involved. And these will be political choices that we need to discuss as society. So I think it's a super central point, and the answer really lies in making this a central consideration of the way how we are thinking of doing business, how we are imagining our economic activity going forward.
Thank you. Simone, would you like to add something?
Yes, thank you. And that's a very good point. And in my first introductory remarks, I was focusing on let's say on a positive message. But of course, transition is a complex job. Transition is not an easy job. Huh? The economist Schumpeter said there is a kind of disruptive creation, so you may do something new. Of course, there is also, we are not just jumping from a difficult world to a fantastic perfect world. We are jumping from a world which is heavily dependent, especially I'm focusing to our European audience, a continent which is relying on today is a paradox. There were numbers going around the public debate about gas dependency. The amount of money that we are paying to the state-owned gas company in Russia now, of the extra cash, not the basic level of costs, the extra cash they are getting because of this hype in the gas prices in Europe in a very manipulated market is more or less 1.5 billion every 2 days. That's, it's a large number if you consider the overall picture. No? So what I'm saying is that it's true. There is an issue concerning raw materials, also in the post-transition world. We will need the critical materials for all the new technologies. But first, again, we are not going to an easy world to a more complex world. Once we will get rid of all that we burn today, and once you burn, a barrel of oil or a cubic meter of gas that is gone forever and produces CO2, we are jumping into an economy where raw materials are critical but manageable according to the principle that Fritzi just mentioned. We as a company, we are working, we are at the beginning. I don't want to say that the problem is solved, but we are working in the industrial process for the utilization of batteries, for example. No? So the idea of raw materials for batteries are one of the key technology for the energy transition because they have to provide the balancing and equilibrium for the renewable sources into the grid. And of course, raw material, if you have to waste your battery after one cycle of utilization, the level of raw material needs is a certain level. If you may recycle it several times, considering that you may also utilize the same component for providing different services with probably less needed quality, you may do a lot on this model. So there is a lot of technology to be put in place. We are at the beginning, but it's clear that the potential of the application of the very concept of the circular economy into the energy transition is very high. And I would say is quite largely not yet explored. The areas are identified, there are people working on that, a lot of R&D, some good experience already delivering results, but there is a long journey a long way to go. That's the same for energy efficiency. We may do a lot. Italy is a country where we have a very little energy primary resources in the country. So we have been already heavily dependent on that. And this is something that not many people know, even in my country. We are one of the countries in the world producing more GDP with utilizing less energy. And if you consider these very simple metrics, the difference among large rich countries are incredible. You may do much more with less. And again, that's not only a matter of reducing your lifestyle, because nobody will do that. It's a matter of how you utilize what you have and which technology you put in place in order to reduce your footprint. So there is a lot to do. It's a good point. We have to work on that. I would say it's one of the key priorities for managing the energy transition in a proper way. But again, I'm pretty much sure that through the technology and also in some way the behavioral change in our society, this may be done.
Thank you. Yes, change takes time. It's uncomfortable and cumbersome. And when we think about social movements, of course, we think about movements that take something about 80 to 90 years, so several generations. And the next question is really addressed to Aishah, and it says, how do you develop a broad and representative consensus among all stakeholders regarding which geopolitical issues to participate in and how to participate?
Well, there's a couple ways to do that. One is coalition. I mean, the whole idea is that you build coalitions that bring the issues to bear in terms of determining those key issues. Right now, climate is the big one. I mean, everyone's talking about it, and everyone's interested in doing climate investments and trying to mitigate some of the crisis that we're dealing with. The other thing that I would say is that unfortunately, crisis builds consensus. It may be short term. Let's just be clear. Like consensus around a crisis is short term, but that's how you get broad coalitions. That's how you build momentum. Around issues like public health. I mean, hopefully, at the end of the pandemic, at the end of everything that's happening, that we have a better broad coalition around how we do public health in the world and support people from all parts of the world, not just countries like the US, but countries like India, countries within Africa, to talk about how they're supported in terms of, but that's where you get the broad consensus from when you have, unfortunately, a crisis, or you do it by coalition, which is what we're doing at GMF right now with the Business and Society Group, is we're trying to build a coalition, transatlantic coalition, to talk about, the issues that are prime. And trust me, we have hard conversations about which ones we feel are the ones we want to put in front or not. Is it ESG? Is it climate? Is it sustainability? Is it income inequality? Is it wage? Is it gender inequality? So it's really about those coalitions, building those coalitions, and those coalitions bringing those issues forward, specifically around the private sector, creating and facilitating those coalitions. So that's basically how I think about it. It's difficult, and we want to be really clear. Consensus is a very difficult thing to establish. Everybody has their issues. Us in the US really understand the difficulty of reaching consensus, but it is about building those coalitions and really identifying the issues that are most important to the people there.
Thank you, Aishah. And then there's another question. I would think, I don't know, I'll open it to you, who wants it. It's by Eric, and it says, how can one reconcile the private sector motivation of businesses as we know them with the very clear geopolitical aims of SOEs from authoritarian states? It seems clear that there's no line between business and state in many authoritarian states. So how can we have an international trade and financial system with businesses that don't operate with a profit motive? Who would like to take that? I think they all have profit motives. They just have a different who they make the profit for. But who would like to answer that question? Who?
I could take a stab at it.
Please. And then I'm sure someone else will add up.
Yeah. I think this again is an important issue. And at the end of the day, it's maybe also about the sheer size. If you have very large players, it does impact the optimal response function for all other players. We have those results in global games for the banking sector. If you have one huge bank and otherwise very small banks, it's the big bank that extracts all the rents, and the small banks will disappear. And the best response function for all the other players is to cooperate. That's their only way to survive. What does this mean? That means that most likely one has to think more strategically in different areas. For example, when it comes to technology, I think that countries have to also have a strategy on which are the technologies where they want to play a leading role, and then create an environment for companies to thrive. And these are different considerations from pure economic market-based considerations that I do think in an environment where you have very large players in some markets do become relevant for places where you have many smaller players. So I think you, again, also in this regard, have a role for a public sector to play and to define the societal goal or the objective of the society, and maybe a definition of an image, how the economy is supposed to look like in the future, and set the frame accordingly.
Hey, I just want to say, so Fritzi, I really appreciate your response. I just want to say, like, I keep getting thrown off with this question because of the question being around authoritarian states. Are you speaking to that specifically, Fritzi? Were you speaking authoritarian states on it?
Well, I was speaking a bit more whether or not a state is authoritarian or not. Mm-hmm. It depends on the size of companies, because then you come into this whole discussion about system competition. No, and that, of course, is also a point. I wanted to make the point, apart from that fact, there is a point to be made about sheer size of companies in a market. And if you are in a market where you have very big players and they may be linked to a government that is very large, whatever the legitimization is, also requires a different response by governments of other countries that have smaller players. That was basically what I was referring to from an economic viewpoint.
This is a, I mean, protecting markets and the market players from, you know, the gigantic asymmetric competitors, especially when they are driven by state-owned top-down policy is an important issue. And I mean, there was a big debate in Europe during the last years about that. And again, I believe that, you know, large corporations tend to work for profit, actually, and and that's good. I mean, it's quite okay until they understand that you know, private sector may proliferate in a situation where the activity is not against what you have around you, you know, against the society. And you know, especially if you look at the, again, I go back to the energy example because just because it is what I know best. But there was a great change. You know, in large projects needed a kind of direct top-down intervention from the government. It's not by chance that many energy companies all around the world were state-owned, and they were very often an economic and industrial tool of a national policy. Now this is more or less over in many regions of the Western world. That's good, in the sense that the relationship between states and the private sectors became more a relationship based on the need to have a policy direction. Look at what the US and Europe are doing, again, on the topic of decarbonization, setting targets, giving a long-term direction, which is very important. You know, free market is not just you know, competitive dynamics in the empty space. It's you know, something that has to be consolidated into a situation where policies are very, very relevant. We go to the very topic that you introduced, Melanie, you know, which is policies and business. I think that there is a in order to make this process harmonious and effective, we must be able, as a business and as a policymaker, to respect very clearly the different roles, no? Which is playing fair into the set of rules which you know, the policymakers are defining for the midterm and long term, with this kind of you know, societal approach that we already discussed with Aishah. And in the meantime, on the public, on the decision makers side, it is very important to be consistent, to be able to give the right directions and to respect market dynamics without utilizing the business as a weapon in order to manage some kind of you know, geopolitical tools. It's clear that again, the business activity is not in the empty space, but it's very important to respect this difference, because otherwise, when you mix up the two worlds, the outcome may be quite confused and maybe bad for the economy and for the policymakers.
Thank you, and apologies, I didn't, the gentleman that posed the question about authoritarian states actually gave some examples, and yes, there is of course also, when it's not purely profit-driven, when he gave the example of Gazprom buying up German companies and then sort of undermining the reservoirs, or Chinese companies investing into multiples in India, and through that effectively blocking European or American companies to enter the market. So which cannot just be purely, one could assume it's not purely profit driven, but maybe there's some other geopolitical aspect to it. Now, we have a little bit of time left, and I would like to go back to something that I think I've discussed with all of you. And so at the moment, what we've been discussing is the opportunity and maybe also the need for a collaboration, particularly in the transatlantic space, thinking in terms of a Marshall Plan, almost from the status quo. But there is also, of course, the future, and we know the private sector. One of you said that, the private sector of course, wants to make. It's a business, and it's not charity. It's not a public state. They want to make profit. And of course, I would argue that for a private sector company, the goal is to be sustainable and still exist in 50 to 100 years. So looking forward to that, there's not just the need to act on facts, and we know climate change is happening, and we know we have only so much time left to act on certain things, but then with it also is really the change in demographics. So societies are changing, societies are aging. I think one of you spoke about by 2050, globally, we will have super aging societies. So population larger than 25% will be older than 65. In less than 10 years, at least in the Western world, most baby boomers will have reached retirement age. And then there is the generation coming up with very different ideas than maybe the super aging have in what is, and how would private sector react to that? Because I think Gen Z and millennials have very different ideas of how the private sector should get involved in societies and be part of societies.
So Melanie, what specifically is your question? Like, how do we plan
the question is,
what
would you think the private sector, taking these change in demographics and change in societies into account, and not just being a, so to say, reactive what now, but how would a private sector really take into this future outlook, let's say in 30 years time, to prepare for that?
If I may, I find Please. This is a very interesting question, and I was just contemplating whether this is not also an area where you do need the frame setting by government. I mean, we do have a lot of discussion about intergenerational fairness, no? So even the question of how much does the government spend today, invest today, and in exchange, and that's itself, no, is a very contentious discussion, and it basically touches exactly at that point that you are making, and I would say that the challenge, of course, is that the decisions that are taken by governments that are democratically elected have the difficulty that the median voter is getting ever older. Yeah, so that there is a bias to maybe investing less, even though if we think about the challenges ahead, we would need very large investments to actually generate economic return in the future. And it's a very difficult point that you're raising, and I think we're still grappling with it. I am hoping maybe, Aishah, that with your stakeholder capitalism approach, you would have some tools to basically take different stakeholders on board in the decision making. We have seen in Germany that we are now, we have a three-party government that's very new for Germany. We never had three parties in government before, and maybe it represents exactly that we have huge challenges ahead, and you basically need a broad discussion in society, because the decisions are fundamental when it comes to investment needs, when it comes to how the framework is set for the time to come, and it's a very decisive decade, if you wish.
Yeah, your question that you asked, Melanie, is very difficult. And stakeholder capitalism is a vehicle. It's not an end, right? It's a way of doing things. But I do want to say that I can speak from a financial services perspective because that's where I'm coming from. And, I feel like it's already happening, meaning in terms of people preparing for the future, but it may not be happening in kind of the legacy institutions, even though they're catching on, like the big institutions that have been around for 100 years. Like that shift for a company of my size to shift, it takes us time. It just takes us time to shift in terms of, what's happening and all the changes that are happening. But I'm telling you, the proliferation of small to medium enterprises in the financial services industry it's stunning to watch. The proliferation of fintechs, just really, and all of them are taking an approach of having this broad coalition of stakeholders that they are accountable to. I mean, they're just doing it really interesting. I love the case of Coinbase. Coinbase, it's skyrocketing, but they dipped a little bit in 2020 because they didn't respond to the racial uprising that was happening in the US, right? And so you're seeing a different response. You're seeing corporations having to be responsive to political moments. They have to be responsive to what's happening. I think that's where we're going. I think that's what you're going to see. And I think corporations are seeing that, but you're going to see like a striated response. You'll have like these new companies doing it from the outset in their mission statement, and then these larger corporations slowly turning their way, they're operating in that way. I'm telling you, I love the shareholder letters. The shareholder letters from the CEOs of big corporations, they have shifted in the last 5 years, and the way they talk about stakeholders, the way they talk about society, the way they talk about the future, the way they talk about sustainability has completely changed. But Larry Fink is like famous for it. No. But I just want to put that out there because it's already happening, but it's not critical mass, right? It's not something that people have visibility on.
Thank you.
May I elaborate a bit more on that, because it is a very important point that when we look at the stakeholder capitalism, we tend to focus on what is outside the company, outside the corporation, no? Outside the usual business model of the corporation, which is a part of the story. A very important part of the story is what is inside the typical business model of the corporation. There is a shift in values. There is a very strong generational aspect here. If you don't sell values, if you don't sell your long-term vision of the world, more and more people are not buying you. More and more talent are not ready to come to your company and work for you because they don't share your values. They don't believe you walk the talk. They believe that what you're saying is just greenwashing and you're not going in the right direction. Maybe they come and after 6 months they leave. This is we work in 40 countries more or less, and this is a quite general process which is emerging more and more, which is creating a very change in how the company is thinking at itself and its priorities, how he's communicating. What Aishah was saying, there's this shift in the way of communicating is clearly aimed at touching the health and the brain of people, trying to connect your long-term values, what as the perception of what is good for the society is at large, and that's more and more evident, especially among the youngest.
Thank you. We're actually at the end. We have about 1 minute left. There was a question for Mirna. I will pass that on to Fritzi and Simone, because I think it's for either one of you, and maybe you can get to Mirna back in writing or something. It's a very specific question about Romania and offshore. So and then there was another comment that it seems that a lot of companies have not shifted away yet from Friedman's, the role of business to take care of business. And thank you for commenting. That's these conversations we have here, for example, with the German Marshall Fund, are very important to drive this topic forward. And I think we can have another discussion about greenwashing, social washing, and what does it look like, the private sector will look like in future, and how the demands of Gen Z, millennials, value-based, will strengthen democracies. So, because that is their approach at the core. is to be participatory, be involved, stay engaged, be part of it. And with that, I would like to thank Fritzi and Aishah and Simone for spending time with us and dedicating time out of their busy schedules for us here at the German Marshall Fund. And I look forward to continue these discussions and have more of these. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.